Jim was in the middle of "When the Music's Over" when he saw the small body sinking beneath the surface of the hotel pool. Without hesitation, he dropped the microphone and ran. What happened next left 4,200 people in complete silence, then chaos. It was August 17th, 1968, at the Anaheim Convention Center. The Doors had just finished "Break On Through," "Light My Fire," and "Roadhouse Blues." The venue was thick with smoke and sweat, the crowd electric. They'd moved outside to the pool area for an experimental midnight set. Morrison was 3 songs in, bare-chested under the California stars, when he stopped mid-verse. But what none of them knew was that a 7-year-old boy had climbed the fence to see his hero. His name was Daniel Hutchins. He couldn't swim. His older sister Maria, 19, had brought him after their mother died 2 weeks earlier. This was supposed to be Daniel's first happy night since the funeral. Before we continue with what happened that night, if you're fascinated by untold stories of rock legends and the moments that defined them, subscribe to this channel. We dig deep into the archives to bring you the stories that changed music history forever. The Anaheim Convention Center pool courtyard was packed beyond capacity that night. Kids had climbed trees and scaled fences to glimpse Morrison, who by August 1968 had become more than a rock star. He was a shaman, a poet, a living contradiction the counterculture had adopted as their dark prophet. Morrison had been drinking heavily that day. Ray Manzarek later recalled Jim had consumed at least a fifth of whiskey between soundcheck and showtime, yet he seemed more focused than he'd been in weeks. The Miami incident was still a year away, and Morrison was riding the peak of his powers, that dangerous intersection where artistic genius meets self-destruction but hasn't yet tipped over the edge. When they launched into "When the Music's Over," Morrison closed his eyes and let the 11-minute epic wash over him. The song was his cathedral, a space where he could escape the Lizard King costume and become something more vulnerable. The crowd swayed in the darkness, lighters flickering like stars. Then Morrison opened his eyes and saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his brief life. Morrison's voice simply stopped. The band played on for 8 bars before they realized their singer had vanished from the stage. The crowd's confusion turned to alarm as they saw Morrison sprinting through the packed bodies toward the pool. People scattered, drinks spilled, someone screamed, and then there was the splash. Morrison hit the water in full leather pants and boots, the weight immediately dragging him down, even as he pushed forward toward the small figure thrashing in the deep end. Daniel Hutchins had been mesmerized by Morrison's performance. His sister Maria had saved for 3 months to buy tickets after their mother's sudden death from a brain aneurysm had shattered their world. Maria worked double shifts at a diner to keep them fed, and this concert was supposed to be their escape. Daniel had never seen a live band before, and when Morrison started singing, something in the boy's chest unlocked. He wanted to get closer, needed to be near that voice that seemed to understand darkness, but wasn't afraid of it. He'd slipped through the crowd, small enough to weave between entranced adults. He'd reached the pool's edge and climbed onto the decorative ledge to see better. Then someone in the crowd surged backward, drunk or startled, and Daniel lost his balance. The water was colder than he expected, darker than he imagined, and suddenly he was sinking with his clothes, pulling him down, and his mouth full of chlorine, and his lungs screaming for air he couldn't reach. Morrison reached Daniel in less than 10 seconds, but to everyone watching it felt like an eternity. The pool lights had been dimmed for atmosphere, and in the darkness, it was hard to see what was happening beneath the surface. Morrison grabbed the boy under the arms and kicked upward, his leather pants now completely waterlogged and acting like anchors. He surfaced once, gasped for air, saw Daniel's pale face, and dove back under to push the child upward with everything he had. When they both broke the surface again, Morrison was coughing, and Daniel wasn't breathing. What happened next was witnessed by thousands, but documented by almost no one. Morrison hauled Daniel to the pool's edge and lifted him out with pure adrenaline. Maria was screaming her brother's name, pushing through the crowd, and Morrison looked up at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not heroic, not proud, but terrified. This was a child who might die because Morrison had inspired him to climb too close to danger. The security team finally arrived at the pool, but they didn't help. The head of security, a former Marine named Jack Delaney, saw Morrison kneeling over the child and made a catastrophic decision. He grabbed Morrison by the shoulder and tried to pull him away, barking about liability and protocols. Morrison, still coughing up pool water, his adrenaline redlining, turned and looked at Delaney with eyes that witnesses later described as inhuman. Morrison stood up, water streaming from his leather pants, and punched Jack Delaney square in the face. It wasn't a wild swing or a drunken stumble. It was a deliberate, focused blow that broke Delaney's nose and sent him sprawling backward. The crack of bone was audible even over the chaos. Ray Manzarek later said it was the only time he'd ever seen Morrison commit actual violence. Morrison fought with words, with his body on stage, with his self-destruction, but he didn't throw punches. Except that night, when a man in a uniform had tried to separate him from a dying child. Daniel started coughing. Water came up, and then vomit, and then he was crying and breathing, and Maria was holding him, and Morrison stepped back, his hand throbbing, looking around at the 4,000 faces staring at him. The band had climbed down from the stage. Security was regrouping. The venue manager was running toward them with a phone in his hand, and Morrison realized with perfect clarity that this moment was about to destroy everything. But here's what nobody expected. Maria Hutchins, 19 years old, and suddenly responsible for her brother's life, made a choice that would keep this story buried for 47 years. When the venue manager arrived talking about police reports and incident forms, Maria looked at Morrison and then at her brother and said no. No police, no ambulance, no paperwork. Daniel was breathing fine. She'd take him to the hospital herself. Why would Maria refuse help and refuse to document what had happened? Maria knew that if police got involved, if Morrison was arrested, the story would explode. Her brother would become the drowning kid in every newspaper. Their dead mother would be mentioned in every article. Their poverty examined by every reporter. And worse, Maria feared that somehow this could become their fault. Maybe there'd be questions about supervision, about whether a 19-year-old should have brought a 7-year-old to a rock concert, about whether social services should get involved. Maria had already lost her mother. She couldn't risk losing Daniel, too. Morrison understood immediately what Maria was doing and why. He knelt down, looked Daniel in the eyes, and said something that only Maria heard clearly. She never told anyone exactly what Morrison said, but 40 years later, she shared the essence of it. Morrison told Daniel that music was supposed to save people, not endanger them, and he was sorry for being the kind of person who attracted danger. Then he stood up, shook Maria's hand, and walked back toward the stage where his band was waiting. The Doors didn't finish the concert. Morrison grabbed the microphone, told the crowd the show was over, and walked off stage without explanation. But Bill Siddons, the Doors manager, moved faster than anyone expected. He got the band into their van within minutes, paid off Delaney with $2,000 in cash, gave the venue manager another $5,000 for damages and silence, and had the Doors out of Anaheim before police arrived. Not a single newspaper reported the incident. Not one music magazine mentioned it. The Anaheim Convention Center never issued a statement. It was as if those few minutes by the pool had been erased from history. Bill Siddons had managed to contain the story completely, paying off everyone who needed paying and making it clear that the Doors' entire future depended on this night disappearing. Morrison himself never spoke about it publicly. Band members later recalled that he referenced the incident only once, during a recording session 3 months later, when he suddenly stopped and said he kept seeing a kid underwater. Ray Manzarek asked if he wanted to talk about it, and Morrison said no. He wanted to forget it because remembering meant acknowledging how close he'd come to witnessing a child's death. Maria and Daniel Hutchins disappeared back into their lives. Daniel later said that for years he thought maybe he'd imagined it all. But Maria kept proof. On that night in 1968, in the chaos and the crowd and the darkness, at least 3 people had taken photographs. One was a professional photographer who'd been covering the concert for a local paper that ultimately never ran the story. The photographer, Stephen Walsh, kept the negatives in a box in his garage for 47 years. He'd been paid by Bill Siddons to hand over all copies and never develop them. But he'd kept the negatives because photographers don't throw away their work. When Walsh died in 2014, his daughter found the box while clearing out his house. She had them processed out of curiosity. And there, in 12 black and white images, was the entire story. Morrison midair diving into the pool, Morrison surfacing with Daniel, Morrison's fist connecting with Jack Delaney's face, Morrison kneeling to talk to the child, Morrison walking away with his shoulders slumped and his clothes dripping. Walsh's daughter posted the photos online in early 2015 with a simple question. "Does anyone know what this is?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Doors fans recognized Morrison instantly. Within days, the story started to reconstruct itself as people who'd been there that night began sharing their memories. And then Maria Hutchins, now 66 years old, saw the photos and decided it was finally time to talk. Maria's interview in 2015 with a rock history podcast filled in all the gaps that the photos couldn't show. She explained why she'd refused documentation, why she'd protected Morrison, why she'd kept silent for nearly 5 decades. She revealed that Morrison had given her his phone number that night and told her to call if Daniel needed anything. Maria never called. She was afraid that contacting Morrison would somehow break the spell, would turn their private miracle into a public spectacle. But she did follow Morrison's career obsessively after that night. She bought every album, read every interview, and when he died in Paris in 1971, she cried harder than she had at her mother's funeral. Daniel didn't understand why his sister was so devastated by a rock star's death. Maria couldn't explain it without revealing the secret. The most remarkable part of Maria's testimony came when she revealed what happened to Daniel. He grew up terrified of water for years after the drowning, refused swimming lessons, wouldn't go near pools or beaches. But when he was 16, something shifted. He started having dreams about the moment Morrison pulled him from the darkness, and instead of fear, he felt something else. Gratitude. Purpose. Daniel enrolled in lifeguard training at 17, became a certified lifeguard at 18, and spent the next 30 years working at beaches and pools across California. By Maria's count, Daniel had performed at least 40 rescues during his career, including saving 3 children from drowning. When the photos emerged and Maria finally told the complete story, Robbie Krieger released a statement confirming every detail. He revealed that Morrison had made the band promise never to discuss that night, not because he was ashamed, but because he didn't want to be celebrated for basic human decency. Morrison felt that diving in to save a drowning child wasn't heroic. It was the minimum requirement of being human. The punch, however, was different. Krieger admitted that Morrison had been shaken by his own violence, had looked at his bruised knuckles for days afterward, and wondered what it meant that he could turn to physical force so quickly. The Anaheim incident was a turning point, where Morrison started to see that his persona was consuming his person, and he didn't know how to stop it. Jack Delaney never spoke about that night until journalists contacted him in 2015. By then, he was 78 years old and suffering from dementia. But he had moments of clarity. In one recorded conversation, he admitted that grabbing Morrison had been a mistake, that in that moment, he'd treated a rescue as a security breach. Delaney died 6 months after that interview, and his family donated the $2,000 Morrison had paid him to a children's water safety foundation. The Anaheim Convention Center demolished its pool area in 1982 during a renovation. But in 2016, after the photos and testimony emerged, the city of Anaheim installed a small plaque near where the pool had been. It doesn't mention Morrison by name. It simply reads, "In memory of those who dive into darkness to pull others toward light. August 17th, 1968. That night in 1968, 4,000 people saw Jim Morrison stop being a rock star and start being human. Most of them forgot it, or chose to forget it, or were paid to forget it. But the photos prove it happened. And somewhere in California, a man in his 60s named Daniel Hutchins carries a scar on his psyche from drowning and a deeper mark on his soul from being saved, knowing that sometimes the music stops so life can continue." Daniel Hutchins spent 30 years as a lifeguard because Jim Morrison dove into a pool to save him. 40 people are alive today because Daniel was trained to do what Morrison did instinctively. The ripple effect of that single spontaneous act of courage expanded in ways that Morrison, who died just 3 years later, never lived to see.